Rebecca Martinez had always preferred the shadows. Even during her years of active service, she'd been the kind of operative who slipped through briefings without drawing attention, completed impossible missions without fanfare, and disappeared back into civilian life as quietly as she'd entered. 3 years had passed since her last official assignment. 3 years of trying to convince herself that a normal life was enough. The call came on a Tuesday morning while she was tending a small garden behind the modest house she'd bought in rural Virginia. No words, just a series of clicks that formed a pattern she recognized from a lifetime ago. The message was clear. Immediate extraction required. Location coordinates followed, burned into her memory before the line went dead. She didn't pack a bag. Professional habits die hard, and she knew that wherever she was going, everything she needed would be provided. Instead, she pulled on worn combat boots, the only remnant of her former life she'd kept, and drove her old pickup truck toward the coordinates that had been transmitted. The facility wasn't marked on any public maps. A simple airfield surrounded by chain-link fencing, the kind of place that processed cargo flights and asked no questions. Rebecca parked outside the perimeter and walked toward the gate, her steps measured and deliberate. The security guard barely glanced up from his newspaper. Inside the fence, she could see ground crew preparing for an incoming aircraft. Their movements were precise, professional, but she recognized the tension in their posture. This wasn't a routine operation. Whatever aircraft was approaching carried passengers important enough to justify extraordinary security measures. The jet appeared as a distant speck against the morning sky, growing larger as it approached the runway. No markings, no identification numbers, just a sleek gray silhouette of military transport designed for discretion. Rebecca positioned herself near a maintenance hangar, close enough to observe, but far enough to avoid immediate attention. As the aircraft touched down and taxied toward the terminal, she felt the familiar quickening of her pulse. The old instincts were awakening, the hyper-awareness that had kept her alive through a dozen impossible situations. Something about this extraction felt different from her previous reactivations, more urgent, more dangerous. The ground crew moved with practiced efficiency, positioning equipment and establishing security perimeters. Rebecca watched their faces, reading the subtle signs of nervousness that indicated they were handling something beyond their normal experience. Whatever was aboard that aircraft, it was significant enough to rattle experienced military personnel. She took a step toward the aircraft, then stopped as a young airman approached with official authority written across his features. His uniform was crisp, his posture perfect, but his eyes held the uncertainty of someone still learning the boundaries of his responsibilities. The confrontation she sensed coming would test more than just security protocols. It would reveal whether 3 years of civilian life had dulled her edge, whether she could still command respect without raising her voice or flashing credentials. More importantly, it would determine whether the people who had summoned her back understood exactly who they were dealing with. The airman was close enough now that she could read his name tag. Peterson. Young, earnest, probably fresh from advanced training and eager to prove himself capable of handling unusual situations. He had no way of knowing that the woman in civilian clothes, standing near his secured perimeter, had written the manual on handling unusual situations. Rebecca remained perfectly still, hands visible, posture non-threatening. She'd learned long ago that the most effective authority often appeared in the form of absolute calm. Let others shout and posture and demand attention. True power whispered. The jet engines wound down to an idle, and she could see movement behind the aircraft's windows. Whoever was aboard would emerge soon, and with them would come answers to questions she hadn't even thought to ask yet. But first, she would have to navigate the challenge of young Peterson and his determination to enforce regulations. He didn't fully understand. 3 years of quiet civilian life had taught her patience. Now it was time to discover if she remembered how to be dangerous. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step back from this area," Airman Peterson said, his voice carrying the careful authority of someone who'd been trained to be polite but firm. "This is a restricted zone for authorized personnel only." Rebecca acknowledged his request with a single nod and moved several steps away from the aircraft, positioning herself in the shadow of the maintenance hangar. She didn't argue, didn't attempt to explain her presence, didn't demand special treatment. The reaction seemed to catch Peterson off guard. Most civilians either became defensive or tried to talk their way past security. Her immediate compliance suggested someone familiar with military protocols. A senior airman approached from the opposite direction, his stripes indicating several years of experience. His name tag read Williams, and his expression suggested he'd dealt with curious civilians before. "Ma'am, you'll need to remain behind the yellow safety line," he called out, gesturing toward markings painted on the tarmac 50 feet from the aircraft. No unauthorized personnel beyond that point. Again, Rebecca moved without protest, walking calmly to the designated area and taking position against a concrete barrier. Her compliance was so immediate and professional that it created an odd dynamic. The security personnel had expected resistance, argument, or at least questions about their authority. Instead, they were dealing with someone who seemed to understand military procedures better than most civilians. "Probably just another aviation enthusiast," Williams muttered to Peterson as they returned to their positions. "We get them sometimes. People who want to see the special aircraft up close." "She doesn't look like a plane spotter," Peterson replied, glancing back toward Rebecca's position. "Something about her seems different, more professional." Williams shrugged. "Could be former military. That would explain why she knows to follow orders without arguing. Still doesn't change the fact that she's not authorized to be here." The ground crew continued their preparations, occasionally glancing in Rebecca's direction, but showing no real concern. She posed no obvious threat, had complied with all security directives, and was maintaining appropriate distance from the aircraft. By all standard measures, she was a resolved minor security issue. But Rebecca was studying them as carefully as they were monitoring her. She read tension in their movements, uncertainty in their frequent radio communications, and something approaching anxiety in the way they kept checking their watches. This extraction was running behind schedule, and that made everyone nervous. The aircraft door remained sealed, and no passengers had emerged. That suggested either a mechanical delay or someone inside who was reluctant to disembark. Neither possibility aligned with the efficient military operation she'd expected. Something was wrong with this picture, and her instincts were beginning to register warning signals. She noticed additional personnel arriving at the facility, men in civilian suits who moved with the purposeful stride of federal agents. They spoke briefly with the senior officer coordinating ground operations, their conversation too distant to overhear, but urgent enough to be visible in their body language. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The delay was becoming significant enough to create visible frustration among the ground crew. Radio chatter increased, with multiple calls to unknown commands seeking guidance on procedural variations. Rebecca recognized the pattern of an operation that was deviating from planned parameters. "Sir, how much longer are we expecting to wait?" Peterson asked his supervisor, a staff sergeant who'd been monitoring communications with increasing concern. "Unknown, Airman. We maintain security protocols until we receive all clear confirmation." "What if the passenger refuses to disembark?" "That's above our pay grade, Peterson. We secure the area and wait for orders." Rebecca absorbed this exchange with growing understanding. Someone aboard the aircraft was making decisions that affected the entire operation. someone with enough authority to keep military personnel waiting indefinitely while they considered their options. Someone who might be evaluating whether the security situation met their standards for proceeding. The federal agents were positioning themselves closer to the aircraft, their movements suggesting preparation for passenger processing, but their presence also indicated complications. Standard military extractions didn't require federal oversight, unless the situation involved agencies beyond normal military jurisdiction. She checked her own position, ensuring she remained within authorized boundaries while maintaining optimal observation angles. Her combat boots felt comfortable on the tarmac, familiar in a way that civilian shoes had never managed. The old habits were returning automatically, the hyper-awareness that had kept her alive through dozens of dangerous situations. The aircraft door finally began to open with mechanical precision, revealing a mobile stairway being positioned by ground crew. But instead of passengers emerging, a single figure appeared at the top of the stairs. A decorated officer in full dress uniform, his bearings suggesting significant command experience and authority that exceeded the local personnel. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. She recognized the type, if not the individual. Someone senior enough to coordinate this extraction personally. Someone whose presence indicated the operation's importance exceeded normal parameters. Someone who was about to demonstrate that her assessment of the situation had been fundamentally incomplete. The officer's eyes swept the assembled personnel with practiced efficiency, clearly searching for someone specific. When his gaze reached Rebecca's position near the concrete barrier, his expression shifted from searching uncertainty to focused recognition. "Where is she?" he asked quietly, but with unmistakable authority that carried across the tarmac. The decorated officer's question hung in the air like a challenge, causing visible confusion among the ground personnel. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the senior enlisted man coordinating security, stepped forward with professional uncertainty written across his features. "Sir, who exactly are we expecting to receive?" Rodriguez asked, consulting his clipboard of authorized personnel listings. "We have no civilians listed on the passenger manifest for this operation." The officer ignored the question completely, his experienced eyes scanning beyond the organized personnel lines with focused intensity. His gaze moved systematically across the facility until it locked directly on Rebecca's position near the maintenance hangar. The recognition was instant and profound. His entire demeanor shifted from searching uncertainty to confident identification. Whatever he had been looking for, he had found it in the woman that security had dismissed as an unauthorized civilian. The ground crew began understanding that their assessment of the situation had been fundamentally incorrect. "Is that actually her?" Peterson whispered to Williams, following the officer's line of sight toward Rebecca. "The woman we moved back to the safety line?" Williams was studying Rebecca with new attention, noting details he'd missed during their initial encounter. Her posture wasn't that of a curious civilian or aviation enthusiast. She stood with the balanced stance of someone trained for immediate action, her hands positioned for quick movement, her attention focused on multiple threat vectors simultaneously. "She's been watching our entire operation," Williams realized, with growing unease. "Not the aircraft, us, our procedures, our communications, our personnel positioning." The federal agents had also noticed the officer's focused attention on Rebecca's location. They began moving in her direction, their movements suggesting preparation for protective escort rather than detention or questioning. Someone had briefed them about her expected presence, even if the military personnel hadn't received the same information. Rebecca remained perfectly still, allowing events to develop according to established protocols. She understood that recognition would come from command authority rather than her own declarations. Any attempt to identify herself prematurely would compromise operational security and potentially endanger personnel who weren't cleared for knowledge of her involvement. The decorated officer descended the aircraft stairs with measured steps, his bearing suggesting someone accustomed to command responsibilities in high-pressure situations. His uniform displayed ribbons indicating service in classified operations, deployments to locations that didn't appear on public records, recognition for achievements that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. "Sir," Rodriguez attempted again, "if you could clarify the identity of the individual we're expected to process, we can coordinate appropriate security measures." "You've already met her," the officer replied without taking his eyes off Rebecca. "The woman your personnel moved to the safety perimeter approximately 40 minutes ago." The implications of that statement rippled through the assembled ground crew like a shockwave. They had treated someone they should have recognized, someone whose presence indicated the true nature of their operation. The civilian they'd politely but firmly redirected was apparently the primary reason for this classified flight. "Sir, respectfully, she presented no identification credentials," Peterson protested, his voice carrying the defensive tone of someone whose professional competence was being questioned. "Standard procedures require verification of authorization before granting access to restricted areas." "Standard procedures," the officer repeated with a slight smile that suggested vast experience with situations that transcended normal protocols. "Ammon, what's your security clearance level?" "Secret, sir." "With additional compartmented access for aviation security operations." "And you believe that clearance qualifies you to verify her authorization?" Peterson hesitated, beginning to understand that he might be operating far outside his depth. "Sir, I was following established security protocols for this facility." "Which protocols specifically address personnel whose clearance exceeds your ability to verify through available channels?" The question exposed the fundamental limitation of Peterson's training. He'd been prepared to handle situations within established parameters, but his education hadn't included scenarios involving individuals whose authority transcended normal verification procedures. The silence that followed demonstrated the gap between theoretical security training and operational reality. Rebecca stepped forward with quiet confidence, moving toward the aircraft without waiting for official permission or escort. Her movement was fluid, purposeful, carrying the unmistakable bearing of someone who belonged exactly where she was going. "That's her," the decorated officer confirmed with obvious relief, addressing the federal agents who'd positioned themselves along her path. "Clear the perimeter and provide appropriate escort." The federal agents fell into formation around Rebecca, their movements suggesting practiced coordination rather than improvised response. They'd been briefed about this moment, prepared for her arrival, positioned to facilitate her movement through security barriers that had been designed to keep others out. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez watched the procession with growing comprehension of what he'd witnessed. This wasn't a case of mistaken civilian curiosity about military operations. This was an official pickup that involved someone whose operational status exceeded his understanding, someone whose authorization couldn't be verified through channels available to facility security personnel. "Sir," Rodriguez addressed the decorated officer as Rebecca approached the aircraft stairs, "for our operational reports, how should we document this individual's clearance status?" The officer considered the question with the careful attention of someone who understood the importance of maintaining appropriate security boundaries. His response would need to satisfy reporting requirements without compromising classified information or revealing details that exceeded Rodriguez's clearance level. "Document her as cleared by command authority," he replied finally. Any personnel requiring additional details about her authorization already possessed the clearance to access that information independently. The non-answer was itself an answer, indicating that Rebecca's identity and operational status were classified beyond the level of facility security personnel. The message was clear. She was authorized, her presence was expected, and questions about her credentials weren't appropriate for their level of access. Rebecca reached the aircraft stairs without acknowledging the attention her movement had generated. She didn't speak to the federal agents or offer any verbal commands to the ground personnel. Her authority was expressed through confident action rather than explicit direction. The decorated officer stepped aside respectfully as she approached the top of the stairs. "Ma'am," he said with obvious deference that suggested he understood exactly who she was. "Transport is ready for immediate departure." She nodded once in professional acknowledgement and disappeared into the aircraft cabin. No other passengers boarded, despite the aircraft's apparent capacity for multiple travelers. The military jet had been dispatched specifically for her transportation, and her transportation alone. As the aircraft doors sealed with hydraulic precision, the assembled personnel remained at their positions, watching the conclusion of an operation that had challenged their understanding of normal military procedures. They'd witnessed something beyond their training, encountered someone whose authority transcended their ability to verify or comprehend. The engine spooled up to takeoff power, and Rebecca Martinez disappeared into whatever mission awaited her. Involvement, leaving behind a group of military professionals who would never forget the day they met someone whose clearance exceeded their wildest imagination. As the unmarked aircraft taxied toward the runway, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez gathered his personnel for an immediate after-action briefing. The unusual nature of the operation required careful documentation, and he needed to ensure his team understood the security implications of what they'd witnessed. "Listen up, everyone," Rodriguez began, his voice carrying the serious tone reserved for classified briefings. "What we observed today falls under operational security protocols that exceed normal facility procedures. I need absolute clarity on how this incident gets reported." Airman Peterson raised his hand tentatively. "Sergeant, who was that woman?" Her behavior suggested military training, but she presented no identification whatsoever. Rodriguez glanced toward the departing aircraft, then back to his assembled team. "Peterson, that's exactly the kind of question you don't ask about situations like this. Some operations involve personnel whose identity is classified beyond our access level." "But sir," Williams interjected, "she approached our restricted area without credentials. Standard protocol required us to deny access until proper authorization could be verified. Did we compromise security by not being more aggressive in our response?" The question revealed the fundamental challenge facing military personnel when normal procedures encountered extraordinary circumstances. They've been trained to follow established protocols, but those protocols assumed that authority could be verified through available channels. "Williams, your response was textbook perfect," Rodriguez assured him. "You identified an unverified individual, politely enforced perimeter security, and maintained appropriate vigilance. The fact that her authorization came from command levels above our verification capability doesn't change the correctness of your initial actions." A federal agent who'd remained behind after the aircraft departure approached their group. His credentials identified him as Agent Thompson, and his bearings suggested extensive experience with classified operations that intersected military and civilian jurisdictions. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Thompson said, "I need to brief your personnel on documentation requirements for this operation. The individual you encountered today operates under special access programs that require specific handling procedures." The ground crew gathered around Thompson, their expressions mixing curiosity with professional caution. They understood they were about to receive information that would affect their careers and potentially their security clearances. "The woman you met is designated under operational codes that I cannot share with personnel at your clearance level," Thompson began. "However, I can tell you that she's been involved in classified activities that directly contributed to national security objectives over the past several years." Peterson leaned forward slightly. Agent Thompson, can you clarify why she approached without identification? Our training emphasizes credential verification for all personnel accessing restricted areas. Thompson nodded approvingly. Good question. Airman. Personnel operating at her level often maintain operational security through anonymity rather than visible credentials. Her lack of identification was a protective measure rather than an oversight or mistake. Protective for whom? Williams asked. For everyone involved, Thompson replied, including you. The less you know about her specific identity and capabilities, the safer you are from potential security complications down the road. The implications of that statement settled over the group like a heavy blanket. They'd encountered someone whose operational activities were dangerous enough that knowledge of her identity could jeopardize the safety of casual observers. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Rodriguez consulted his notebook, preparing to document the incident according to whatever guidelines Thompson was about to provide. Agent Thompson, how do we report this extraction in our operational logs? Simple, Thompson said, pulling out a standardized form. Military aircraft landed for passenger pickup. One individual transported to classified destination. Passenger identification verified by command authority. No security incidents or complications. The sanitized description bore no resemblance to the dramatic recognition scene they'd witnessed, the confusion over credentials, or the obvious importance of the operation. Their detailed observations would be reduced to a few administrative sentences that revealed nothing about the extraordinary nature of what had occurred. Sir, Peterson ventured, what about the recognition scene with the decorated officer? That seems significant enough to warrant detailed documentation. Thompson considered the question carefully. Airman, that officer's presence confirmed that extraction procedures were followed correctly. The details of his interaction with the passenger aren't relevant to your facility's security reporting requirements. The message was clear, bare. Role had been to provide secure transportation facilities, not to analyze or document the interpersonal dynamics of classified operations. They were expected to observe, facilitate, and forget rather than investigate or speculate. As Thompson prepared to leave, Rodriguez asked one final question. Agent Thompson, are we likely to encounter similar situations in the future? Should we modify our training or procedures based on today's experience? Thompson paused at his vehicle door, considering his response. Sergeant, I can tell you that new protocols are being developed for handling personnel whose authorization exceeds standard verification procedures. Your facility has been selected as a testing ground for those enhanced protocols. The revelation that their routine cargo facility was being transformed into a testing ground for extraordinary security procedures added another layer of significance to the day's events. They weren't just witnesses to an unusual extraction. They were participants in the development of new operational capabilities. What kind of enhanced protocols? Williams asked. The kind that recognize authority without requiring traditional credential verification, Thompson replied. Sometimes the most important people are the ones who can't afford to carry identification. After Thompson departed, the ground crew remained on the tarmac, processing the implications of their briefing. They'd been introduced to a world where normal military procedures intersected with operations that exceeded their understanding, where their facility served purposes beyond routine cargo handling. Rodriguez, Peterson said quietly, do you think we'll see her again? The staff sergeant looked toward the horizon where the unmarked aircraft had disappeared, carrying its mysterious passenger toward whatever mission required her unique qualifications. Peterson, something tells me that if we do see her again, it'll be because something very serious is happening in the world. The thought sobered them all. They'd been granted a glimpse into operations that existed beyond public knowledge, activities that influenced events without leaving fingerprints in official records. The woman they'd briefly encountered represented capabilities that governments deployed only when conventional approaches had failed. As they secured the facility and completed their shift reports, each of them understood that they'd participated in something historically significant, even if they couldn't fully comprehend its scope or implications. They'd met someone whose existence challenged their understanding of how military and intelligence operations actually functioned. The unmarked aircraft was already hundreds of miles away, carrying Rebecca Martinez toward whatever crisis required her intervention. But her brief presence at their facility had permanently altered their perspective on the hidden mechanisms that protected national security through methods that officially didn't exist. 3 days after Rebecca's extraction from the Virginia airfield, secure communication networks across multiple agencies began receiving encrypted messages that hadn't been transmitted in over 3 years. The content was minimal, but the implications were staggering for those who understood the significance of the call signs being reactivated. At Langley, Deputy Director Patricia Hoffman was reviewing routine intelligence briefings when her secure terminal chimed with an incoming message bearing classification, markings she hadn't seen since her early career. The sender was identified only as Echo Red Primary, a designation that should have been permanently retired after the political purges that had swept through the intelligence community several years earlier. Status report required, the message read. Threat assessment indicates immediate consultation necessary. Standard protocol suspended pending operational directives. Hoffman stared at the screen for several minutes, her mind racing through the implications of receiving communication from someone who officially no longer existed. Echo Red had been the most effective operative in the history of their agency, responsible for resolving crises that would have escalated into international incidents without her intervention. But Echo Red had also been politically inconvenient. Her methods, while extraordinarily effective, operated in gray areas that made official acknowledgement impossible. When congressional oversight had intensified and public accountability became a priority, someone had made the decision to erase her from all accessible records. The fact that she was communicating again meant that someone with extraordinary authority had reactivated her operational status. Someone who understood that conventional approaches were insufficient for whatever crisis had developed. Hoffman composed a carefully worded response, knowing that their communication was being monitored by automated systems designed to detect patterns that might compromise operational security. Advisory consultation available through established channels. Current threat environment requires enhanced coordination protocols. Meanwhile, at the Pentagon, General Marcus Webb was experiencing his own moment of recognition. The 4-star general had built his career on successful crisis management, but he'd never forgotten the operative who had saved his career during a hostage situation in Eastern Europe 15 years earlier. Webb had been a colonel then, commanding a unit and walked into an ambush that should have ended with multiple casualties and an international incident. Instead, a single operative had appeared without warning, neutralized the threat, extracted his personnel, and disappeared before official debriefings could be conducted. He'd learned her operational designation months later through classified channels. Echo Red, the woman who handled situations that couldn't be solved through conventional military approaches. The problem solver who appeared when failure wasn't an acceptable outcome. Now his secure terminal was displaying a message from that same operative, requesting immediate military liaison support for an unspecified operation. The request carried authorization codes that bypassed normal approval procedures, indicating presidential-level clearance for whatever mission she was conducting. Webb forwarded the message to his most trusted aide with a single instruction: provide whatever support she requests. No questions, no documentation, no limits on resources. At FBI headquarters, Assistant Director James Crawford was dealing with his own Echo Red encounter. His counterterrorism division had been tracking suspicious financial transactions that suggested a major operation in development, but the patterns were too sophisticated for normal investigative approaches. The secure communication from Echo Red contained analysis that filled gaps in their investigation, providing insights that would have taken his team months to develop independently. More importantly, it included actionable intelligence that could prevent whatever attack was being planned. Crawford had heard stories about Echo Red during his years in military intelligence, but he'd assumed they were exaggerated legends about an operative whose capabilities couldn't possibly match the reputation. Now he was receiving evidence that the legends might have understated her abilities. The intelligence she provided wasn't just accurate. It was comprehensive enough to suggest sources and methods that exceeded anything in his experience. She wasn't just gathering information. She was analyzing global patterns and predicting outcomes with precision that bordered on prescience. In a secure conference room at the State Department, Ambassador Catherine Reynolds was briefing her senior staff about diplomatic complications that had emerged from recent events in Eastern Europe. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, with multiple governments taking positions that made peaceful resolution increasingly unlikely. Her secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from an unknown sender. Diplomatic intervention required within 72 hours. Current trajectory leads to permanent alliance disruption. Alternative approaches available through back channel. Coordination. Reynolds recognized the communication style from classified briefings she'd received early in her diplomatic career. The sender was someone with access to intelligence that exceeded normal diplomatic channels, someone who understood the long-term implications of current events better than the governments involved. The message included detailed analysis of political pressures influencing each government's position, along with specific recommendations for diplomatic approaches that could preserve essential relationships while allowing face-saving compromises. The quality of analysis suggested access to information that wasn't available through official intelligence channels. At the National Security Council, Director Michael Torres was coordinating responses to multiple developing crises when his aide delivered a priority message marked with clearance codes he'd never seen before. The sender was identified as Echo Red, a designation that meant nothing to him but clearly carried extraordinary authority. Multi-vector threat assessment complete, the message stated. Current situation requires coordinated response across all agencies. Recommend immediate interagency coordination meeting under special access protocols. Torres had been managing national security crises for over a decade, but he'd never received a message that assumed authority to coordinate activities across multiple agencies. The sender wasn't requesting coordination. She was directing it, with confidence that suggested knowledge of threats that exceeded his current understanding. The most unsettling aspect was the accuracy of her assessment. He'd been struggling to identify connections between seemingly unrelated incidents across different regions, but her analysis revealed patterns that made the relationships obvious once they were pointed out. Within hours of Rebecca's reactivation, a network of senior officials across the intelligence and military communities were receiving communications that demonstrated capabilities they'd only heard about in whispered conversations. They were experiencing first-hand contact with someone whose operational effectiveness had become legendary within classified circles. Each official faced the same choice: trust the intelligence being provided by someone whose identity was classified beyond their access level, or continue pursuing conventional approaches that were proving inadequate for the developing crisis. The unanimity of their response would have surprised outside observers. Without exception, They chose to trust Echo Red's analysis and follow her recommendations. Their experience with national security challenges had taught them to recognize exceptional competence, even when they couldn't verify its source. By the end of the week, Rebecca Martinez had established operational coordination with every major security agency in the federal government. She wasn't working for any of them. She was working with all of them, providing analysis and direction. That enhanced their individual capabilities while pursuing objectives that none of them fully understood. The network that had been dormant for 3 years was fully operational again, centered around an operative whose existence was officially denied, but whose influence was reshaping the government's response to emerging threats. The quiet professional had returned to work, and the world was about to discover what that meant for everyone involved. 2 weeks into Rebecca's reactivation, the first signs of success began appearing in classified briefings across Washington. The suspicious financial transactions that had worried FBI counterterrorism suddenly dried up. The diplomatic crisis in Eastern Europe found unexpected resolution through back-channel negotiations. Military units reported successful interdiction of weapons shipments that intelligence agencies hadn't even detected. But with success came complications. Congressional oversight committees began asking questions about the sudden improvement in agency effectiveness. Budget analysts noticed unusual coordination between departments that normally competed for resources. Investigative journalists started recognizing patterns in seemingly unrelated government successes. Senator Patricia Blackwood, chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, called an emergency hearing to address what she termed unexplained improvements in operational efficiency across multiple agencies. Her reputation for aggressive oversight had made her a formidable presence in Washington, someone who viewed government secrecy as a personal challenge to be overcome. Director Torres, Blackwood began the classified hearing. Your latest briefing indicates a 70% improvement in threat assessment accuracy over the past 2 weeks. Can you explain this sudden enhancement in capabilities? National Security Council Director Torres had prepared for this question, but his answer required careful navigation between truthfulness and operational security. Senator, we've enhanced interagency coordination protocols and improved information sharing procedures between departments. That's bureaucratic double talk, Director. I want specifics. What enhanced protocols? Which information sharing procedures? Who authorized these changes? Torres glanced at the other officials seated at the witness table, each of whom had been receiving similar questions from their oversight committees. They'd coordinated their responses, but Senator Blackwood's reputation for thorough investigation made deception risky. Senator, the improvements stem from consultation with subject matter experts whose operational experience provides enhanced analytical capabilities, Torres replied carefully. Subject matter experts, Blackwood repeated with obvious skepticism. Are these experts government employees? Contractors? Foreign nationals? I need names, clearance levels, and budgetary allocations. The question struck at the heart of Echo Red's operational security. Any attempt to provide official documentation about Rebecca's involvement would compromise her anonymity and potentially endanger ongoing operations. But refusing to answer would escalate congressional suspicion and potentially trigger formal investigations. FBI Assistant Director Crawford leaned forward in his chair. Senator, some consultations involve personnel whose identity is classified for operational security reasons. Disclosure could compromise ongoing investigations and endanger lives. Assistant Director Crawford, that's exactly the kind of answer that concerns me. This committee has oversight responsibility for intelligence operations, including the authority to review classified personnel files when necessary for proper oversight. The standoff was developing along predictable lines. Congressional oversight versus operational security Transparency versus effectiveness. Public accountability versus national security. The same tension that had led to Echo Red's original retirement was manifesting again. General Webb spoke up from his position at the witness table. "Senator, may I suggest that some operations require flexibility that doesn't fit neatly into normal oversight procedures? The improvements you've noted stem from approaches that have proven extraordinarily effective, but don't translate well into standard reporting formats." General Webb, that sounds suspiciously like you're asking this committee to take effectiveness on faith without examining methods. That's not how oversight works in a democracy. Senator Blackwood's chief of staff whispered something in her ear, causing her expression to shift from skeptical to alert. She'd received information that changed her approach to the questioning. "Gentlemen," she continued, "my staff has been conducting background research on recent operational patterns. We've identified communication traffic indicating coordination with an individual whose existence isn't reflected in any accessible personnel databases. Can you explain this discrepancy?" The question revealed that Congressional investigators had detected Echo Red's electronic footprint, despite precautions designed to prevent such discovery. The situation was escalating beyond the witness table's ability to manage through careful answers. CIA Deputy Director Hoffman exchanged glances with Torres, recognizing that their coordinated response strategy was failing. Senator Blackwood had clearly identified enough details to pursue formal investigation, which could expose Rebecca's involvement, despite their efforts to protect her anonymity. "Senator," Hoffman said carefully, "some operations involve personnel whose official status is maintained through special access programs that exist specifically to protect operational effectiveness. These individuals operate under authorities that predate current oversight requirements." Deputy Director Hoffman, are you telling me that this person operates outside congressional oversight? That's constitutionally problematic, and I won't accept it as an explanation. The hearing was approaching a crisis point. Congressional determination to identify Echo Red was colliding with operational requirements that couldn't survive public exposure. The officials at the witness table understood that they were caught between irreconcilable demands. Torres made a decision that would define the remainder of the hearing. "Senator, I request permission to provide additional details in a closed session with only committee members present. The information involves ongoing operations that require the highest level of security." Senator Blackwood considered the request, weighing her determination to extract information against the potential risks of pushing too hard against genuine security concerns. Her experience with classified matters had taught her to recognize when officials were hiding legitimate secrets versus when they were simply avoiding accountability. "Request granted, Director Torres. We'll clear the room except for committee members and essential staff. But I want complete disclosure about this mysterious consultant, whose effectiveness has impressed everyone except the people responsible for oversight." As the hearing room cleared of non-essential personnel, the remaining officials prepared for a conversation that would determine whether Echo Red could continue operating or would be forced back into official retirement. The balance between effectiveness and accountability was about to be tested again. Senator Blackwood activated additional security protocols for the closed session, ensuring that whatever was revealed would be protected by the highest level of classification. She understood that she was about to learn something that would test her own commitment to transparency versus national security. "Gentlemen," she began the closed session, "I'm prepared to hear whatever you need to tell me. But I want complete honesty about who this person is and what authority they're operating under. The effectiveness you've described suggests capabilities that exceed normal government operations." The witness table fell silent as each official considered how much truth they could reveal without compromising operations that were proving essential. to national security. They were about to discover whether congressional oversight could accommodate someone whose very existence challenged conventional understanding of how government actually functioned. Director Torres took a deep breath and began speaking. Senator, 15 years ago, this government encountered situations that couldn't be resolved through conventional approaches. We developed capabilities that operated outside normal structures, because normal structures were inadequate for the threats we faced. Continue, Director. The individual providing consultation has operational experience that saved American lives, prevented international incidents, and resolved crises that would have escalated beyond our ability to manage. Our effectiveness comes from methods that can't be officially acknowledged. Senator Blackwood leaned back in her chair, processing the implications of what she was hearing. Her effectiveness, Director? We're discussing a female operative whose identity is classified beyond my clearance. Level? The revelation that Echo Red was female added another dimension to the conversation, one that intersected with Senator Blackwood's own experience as a woman navigating male-dominated power structures in Washington. Yes, Senator, and her operational record justifies whatever special arrangements are necessary to maintain her effectiveness. The closed session had stretched past midnight, with Senator Blackwood receiving briefings that challenged her understanding of how national security operations actually functioned. The documentation presented by the witness panel revealed a pattern of extraordinary success, achieved through methods that defied conventional military and intelligence protocols. Senator, Director Torres continued, 3 years ago, political pressure forced us to retire our most effective operative. The decision was made to prioritize oversight compliance over operational effectiveness. We've spent 3 years watching preventable crises escalate because we lacked the capabilities she provided. Senator Blackwood studied the classified files spread across the conference table, each document revealing successful operations that had prevented disasters without leaving traces in public records. Hostage rescues that prevented international incidents. Terrorist plots disrupted before they could develop into active threats. Diplomatic crises resolved through interventions that preserved relationships while allowing all parties to claim victory. These operational summaries indicate she was single-handedly responsible for preventing conflicts that could have cost thousands of lives. Blackwood observed, her voice carrying grudging admiration. Why was someone this effective forced into retirement? Deputy Director Hoffman answered carefully. Senator, her methods operate in areas where official accountability becomes problematic. She achieves results that serve national interests, but the techniques can't be officially sanctioned or publicly acknowledged. Give me specifics, Deputy Director. What techniques are we discussing? The officials exchanged glances, understanding. That complete disclosure would cross lines they'd been trying to avoid. But Senator Blackwood's determination to understand the full scope of Echo Red's capabilities left them with few alternatives. She operates without official cover or backup support, General Webb explained. No extraction plans, no diplomatic immunity, no government protection if operations go wrong. She accepts complete personal risk in exchange for operational flexibility that exceeds what we can provide through official channels. She infiltrates organizations and governments, using identities that can't be traced to American intelligence, Crawford added. Her success rate stems from the fact that targets don't recognize her as a government operative until it's too late to respond effectively. Senator Blackwood processed these revelations with the careful attention of someone who understood the legal and political implications. Gentlemen, you're describing someone who operates as an unofficial agent of the United States government without the protections or limitations that govern official personnel. Yes, Senator. And that's exactly why she's so effective. The admission hung in the air like a confession, acknowledging that the government's most successful operative functioned outside the very oversight mechanisms that Senator Blackwood represented. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. What's her current operational status? Blackwood asked. Is she conducting missions right now that this committee should know about? Torres hesitated before responding. Senator, she's currently addressing threats that our conventional capabilities couldn't handle effectively. The improvements in agency performance that prompted this hearing are direct results of her intervention. Director Torres, I need to understand the scope of her current activities. Is she operating domestically? Internationally? Are American citizens potentially affected by her operations? The question struck at the heart of constitutional limitations on government power. Echo Red's effectiveness stemmed partly from her ability to operate without the legal constraints that governed official agencies. But that flexibility raised serious questions about oversight and accountability. Her operations are global in scope, Hoffman admitted. She addresses threats to American interests regardless of where they originate or develop. Geographic boundaries don't limit her operational area. And oversight of these global operations comes from where, exactly? Presidential authority? Torres replied. She reports directly to decision-makers who understand the full scope of her capabilities and the situations that require her intervention. Senator Blackwood leaned forward, her expression mixing respect with concern. Are you telling me that this operative has direct access to the president? That she's conducting operations under presidential authority without congressional knowledge? The revelation elevated the discussion beyond agency oversight into constitutional territory, involving the balance of power between executive and legislative branches. Senator Blackwood was discovering that effective national security sometimes required approaches that challenged traditional democratic accountability. Senator, General Webb said carefully, some threats to national security require responses that can't survive public debate or political consideration. Her effectiveness stems from the ability to act immediately when conventional approaches would require weeks of review and approval. General Webb, that's a dangerous argument. You're suggesting that democratic oversight is incompatible with effective security operations. I'm suggesting that some security operations are incompatible with normal oversight timelines. The threats she addresses don't wait for congressional approval or public debate. Senator Blackwood stood and walked to the secure windows overlooking the Capitol grounds, considering the implications of what she'd learned. She understood that she was facing a choice between transparency and effectiveness, between constitutional principles and national security requirements. Gentlemen, I need to ask a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Is this operative currently conducting activities that could be considered illegal under federal law? The silence that followed demonstrated the complexity of her question. Echo Red's operations existed in areas where legality depended on perspective, where actions that served national interests might violate specific statutes, where effectiveness sometimes required approaches that couldn't be officially sanctioned. Senator, Torres answered finally. She operates under authorities that supersede normal legal limitations. Her activities are sanctioned at the highest levels of government, even when they might appear problematic under standard legal review. That's not an answer, Director. That's a justification for actions you're afraid to describe directly. Crawford leaned forward in his chair. Senator, may I suggest that some questions can't be answered in ways that satisfy both legal and operational requirements? Her effectiveness comes from operating in areas where normal rules don't apply. Senator Blackwood returned to her seat, her expression reflecting the weight of information that challenged her fundamental assumptions about government accountability. She'd entered the hearing determined to expose bureaucratic inefficiency. Instead, she'd discovered operations that exceeded her understanding of how national security actually functioned. I need time to consider the implications of what you've told me, she said finally. But I want to be clear about one thing. This committee has oversight responsibility for intelligence operations, and that includes operations conducted under special authorities. We understand, Senator, but we also hope you understand that some operations can't survive normal oversight procedures without losing the effectiveness that makes them necessary. The standoff between congressional oversight and operational security had reached its inevitable conclusion. Senator Blackwood possessed information that could expose Echo Red's activities, but she also understood that exposure would eliminate capabilities that had proven essential to national security. Her decision would determine whether Rebecca Martinez could continue operating or would be forced into permanent retirement, whether the government would maintain capabilities that transcended normal limitations or would accept reduced effectiveness in exchange for enhanced accountability. The hearing ended with no formal resolution, but with all parties understanding that Senator Blackwood now possessed the information necessary to destroy or protect operations that existed beyond public knowledge. Her choice would define the future of American intelligence capabilities. 3 weeks after the classified hearing, Senator Blackwood requested a private meeting with Rebecca Martinez. The location was unusual, a small coffee shop in suburban Virginia, far from the corridors of power where such conversations normally occurred. No security details, no official protocols, just two women discussing matters that would influence the future of American national security. Rebecca arrived precisely on time, dressed in civilian clothes that could belong to any professional woman meeting a colleague for coffee. Her appearance revealed nothing about capabilities that had shaped international events or operations that had prevented disasters from becoming public knowledge. Senator Blackwood was already seated at a corner table, her expression mixing curiosity with the careful attention of someone who understood she was meeting a legend. The woman across from her looked remarkably ordinary for someone whose operational record read like a collection of impossible missions. Ms. Martinez, Blackwood began, using the civilian name that appeared on no official documents. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I'll be direct. I need to understand whether your operations are compatible with democratic oversight, or whether they represent a fundamental challenge to constitutional government. Rebecca considered the question while studying the senator's face, reading the genuine concern of someone who dedicated her career to protecting democratic institutions. Senator Blackwood, may I ask what you hope to accomplish with this conversation? I want to understand whether someone with your capabilities can operate within a system designed to prevent exactly the kind of unchecked power you represent. The challenge was stated politely but directly. Senator Blackwood was questioning whether Echo Red's effectiveness was worth the constitutional complications her methods created. Senator, over the past 15 years, I've prevented 3 major terrorist attacks that would have killed thousands of people. I've disrupted weapons trafficking networks that were supplying materials for nuclear devices. I've negotiated the release of hostages when official diplomacy failed and military rescue was impossible. I've read the classified summaries of your operations, Miss Martinez. Your effectiveness is undeniable, but effectiveness achieved through methods that can't be officially acknowledged raises serious questions about democratic accountability. Rebecca sipped her coffee, choosing her words carefully. Senator, democratic accountability assumes that threats to democracy will wait for democratic processes to respond. Some threats operate faster than democratic institutions can react. That's the same argument used by authoritarian governments to justify suspending democratic rights. How do I know that your operations serve democratic values rather than undermining them? The question struck at the philosophical heart of Echo Red's existence. Her effectiveness came from operating outside democratic constraints, but her purpose was protecting democratic society from threats that couldn't be addressed through normal democratic means. Senator, Every operation I've conducted has been designed to preserve American democratic institutions and protect American lives. I don't operate for personal gain or political advantage. I operate when democratic society faces threats that democratic processes can't address effectively. But who makes that determination? Who decides when threats justify bypassing democratic oversight? You? The president? Some committee I've never heard of? Rebecca met Senator Blackwood's gaze directly. Senator, that's exactly the question. I can't answer without compromising operational security. But I can tell you that every operation receives authorization from the highest levels of government. The highest levels of government include Congress. Ms. Martinez, this committee has oversight responsibility for intelligence operations, regardless of how they're authorized. The constitutional standoff was crystallizing around the fundamental tension between effectiveness and accountability. Senator Blackwood represented the principle that government power must be subject to democratic oversight. Rebecca represented the reality that some government actions couldn't survive democratic debate. Senator, Rebecca said carefully, may I ask what you intend to do with the information you've received about my operations? The question forced Senator Blackwood to confront the choice she'd been avoiding since the classified hearing. She could expose Echo Red's activities through public hearings, ensuring democratic accountability, but eliminating capabilities that have proven essential to national security. Or she could protect operations that challenged democratic principles but served democratic interests. Ms. Martinez, I've been considering that question for 3 weeks. I've read every classified file available about your operations. I've consulted with constitutional scholars about the legal implications of unofficial government agents. I've lost sleep thinking about the consequences of whatever decision I make. Rebecca waited silently, understanding that Senator Blackwood was working through the same philosophical conflicts that had challenged every official who'd learned about Echo Red's existence. I've reached a conclusion that surprises me, Blackwood continued. I believe that democratic society sometimes requires protection through methods that can't be democratically sanctioned. I believe that you serve democratic values, even though your methods challenge democratic processes. The admission represented a significant philosophical shift for someone who'd built her career on aggressive oversight of government power. Senator Blackwood was acknowledging that democratic society's survival might sometimes depend on undemocratic methods. However, she continued, I also believe that power without oversight eventually becomes corrupt, regardless of how noble its original intentions. I can't simply ignore constitutional responsibilities because your operations have been effective. Rebecca nodded, understanding that Senator Blackwood was seeking a middle ground between exposure and acceptance. What are you proposing, Senator? I'm proposing a compromise that satisfies both operational security and democratic oversight. I want quarterly briefings about your general operational activities, without specific details that could compromise security. I want assurance that your operations serve clearly defined national interests. And I want the authority to end your unofficial status if I determine that your activities have exceeded appropriate boundaries. The proposal would create informal oversight that provided democratic accountability without destroying operational effectiveness. Senator Blackwood would monitor Echo Red's activities without controlling them, ensuring that unlimited power remains subject to some form of democratic review. Senator, I can accept those terms on one condition. Our arrangement remains classified at the highest levels. Public knowledge of unofficial oversight would be as dangerous as public knowledge of my operations. Agreed, Ms. Martinez. Our arrangement will be documented through special access programs that protect both operational security and oversight responsibility. The handshake that sealed their agreement created an unprecedented arrangement in American government. Unofficial oversight of unofficial operations, democratic accountability for undemocratic methods, constitutional review of activities that existed beyond constitutional frameworks. Senator Blackwood would return to Washington with information that could destroy Echo Red's effectiveness. But she'd chosen to protect operations that served democratic values through undemocratic means. She'd discovered that preserving democracy sometimes required accepting approaches that challenged democratic principles. Rebecca Martinez would continue operating with the quiet confidence of someone who'd found a way to serve her country without compromising the constitutional values that defined her country. Her effectiveness would remain protected by someone who understood both the necessity and the danger of power that operated beyond normal limitations. The coffee shop meeting ended with both women understanding that they'd created something unique. In American government, a balance between effectiveness and accountability that served democratic society while respecting democratic values. The quiet professional would continue her work, but now under the watchful eye of democratic oversight that ensured her power remained focused on protecting the society that had given her that power. 3 months later, when international crises once again required capabilities that exceeded conventional approaches, Rebecca Martinez disappeared into whatever mission awaited her intervention. But this time, Senator Blackwood received a classified briefing about general operational objectives, ensuring that even unofficial operations remained subject to democratic review. The system had evolved to accommodate someone whose existence challenged every assumption about how government should function. Democracy had found a way to protect itself through methods that democracy couldn't officially acknowledge, creating a new model for balancing effectiveness with accountability in an increasingly complex world. The quiet professional continued her work serving democratic values through undemocratic methods, protecting constitutional government through unconstitutional means, preserving the society that had created the oversight mechanisms designed to limit exactly the kind of power she wielded. In the end, both effectiveness and accountability had been preserved through an arrangement that satisfied neither democratic theory nor operational doctrine, but served both democratic society and national security interests. The compromise wasn't perfect, but it was workable, and in a world of imperfect threats, workable solutions were often the best that democratic society could achieve. 6 months later, the secure facility in Virginia had returned to its routine operations, processing cargo flights and maintaining the quiet efficiency that characterized military aviation support. But the personnel who had witnessed Rebecca Martinez's extraction carried themselves differently now, with the subtle confidence of people who understood they'd participated in something historically significant. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been promoted to Master Sergeant, partly in recognition of his professional handling of an extraordinary security situation. During his promotion ceremony, a senior officer mentioned quietly that his facility had been selected for permanent inclusion in special access operations, recognition that their team could handle situations that exceeded normal parameters. Airman Peterson, now a senior airman, had become something of an expert on unconventional security protocols. His training reports included new sections on recognizing authority that couldn't be verified through standard channels. Lessons learned from the day he'd encountered someone whose clearance exceeded his ability to understand. The security manual for the facility now included protocols that seemed almost mystical to new personnel. Respect authority that presents itself with quiet confidence rather than official credentials. Some individuals serve at levels that require anonymity for operational effectiveness. When in doubt, observe behavior rather than demanding documentation. The additions to their procedures had attracted attention from other military facilities, leading to requests for training consultations about handling personnel whose operational status transcended normal verification procedures. Rodriguez found himself briefing security teams across the country about lessons learned from encounters with extraordinary individuals. Meanwhile, in Washington, Senator Blackwood had quietly established the most classified oversight program in congressional history. Her quarterly briefings with Rebecca occurred in locations that changed regularly, always in formal settings that provided security through anonymity rather than official protection. The arrangement had proven more valuable than either woman had anticipated. Rebecca's insights into global threat patterns enhanced congressional understanding of national security challenges, while Senator Blackwood's oversight ensured that unlimited power remained subject to democratic review. During their most recent meeting, conducted during a morning walk through Arlington National Cemetery, Senator Blackwood had asked about the scope of threats that required Echo Red's intervention. "Senator," Rebecca had replied, "the world is more dangerous than public knowledge can accommodate. Democratic society depends on threats being resolved before they become visible to democratic debate. My role is ensuring that democracy survives long enough to debate the appropriate responses to dangers that would destroy democracy, while democracy was deciding how to respond." The philosophical complexity of her answer reflected the moral ambiguity that defined her existence. She served democratic values through undemocratic methods, protected constitutional government through unconstitutional means, preserved a society that had created the oversight mechanisms designed to limit exactly the kind of power she wielded. Senator Blackwood had come to understand that Rebecca Martinez represented something unique in American government, proof that democratic society could evolve to protect itself without abandoning the principles that defined it. The compromise they'd created wasn't perfect, but it was profoundly American in its pragmatic balance between idealism and necessity. The quarterly briefings had also revealed the global scope of threats that never appeared in public reporting. Terrorist networks disrupted before they could plan attacks. Weapons trafficking operations eliminated before they could supply dangerous materials. Diplomatic crises resolved before they could escalate into military conflicts. Each success represented lives saved, disasters prevented, conflicts avoided through interventions that left no traces in official records. Rebecca's operational activities were reshaping international events in ways that protected American interests while preserving global stability. But perhaps most importantly, the oversight arrangement had demonstrated that democratic institutions could adapt to extraordinary circumstances without abandoning democratic principles. Senator Blackwood's review ensured that power remained accountable, even when it operated beyond normal accountability mechanisms. During their final meeting of the year, Rebecca had shared something that surprised Senator Blackwood. "Senator, your oversight has made me more effective, not less. Knowing that my activities are subject to democratic review ensures that I never lose sight of the values I'm protecting. Power without oversight eventually serves itself rather than the people it was created to protect." The admission revealed that even someone operating at Rebecca's level understood the importance of democratic accountability. Her effectiveness wasn't diminished by oversight. It was enhanced by the assurance that her power remained focused on serving democratic society rather than transcending it. As the year concluded, both women reflected on the unprecedented arrangement they'd created. Senator Blackwood had discovered that democratic oversight could accommodate extraordinary situations without abandoning democratic principles. Rebecca had learned that accountability enhanced rather than constrained her effectiveness. The quiet professional continued her work, serving democratic values through undemocratic methods, protecting constitutional government through unconstitutional means, preserving the society that had created the oversight mechanisms designed to ensure that even unlimited power remained subject to democratic review. In government facilities across the country, security personnel received training about handling encounters with individuals whose authority exceeded normal verification procedures. The lessons learned from Rebecca's reactivation had influenced military and intelligence operations throughout the system, creating new protocols for managing situations that transcended standard operating procedures. The story of Echo Red would never appear in history books or official records. Her operations would remain classified beyond public access, her identity protected by the same secrecy that enabled her effectiveness. But her influence on American national security would continue for decades through the precedents she'd established, the threats she'd prevented, and the balance she'd helped create between effectiveness and accountability. The quiet professional had found her place in democratic society, serving it through methods that democracy couldn't officially acknowledge, protecting it through power that democracy couldn't officially sanction, preserving it through oversight that democracy could officially embrace. Years later, when military historians attempted to document significant intelligence operations of the era, they would encounter systematic gaps in official records. Missions that had clearly occurred but left no verifiable traces in accessible databases. Operations whose results suggested capabilities that officially didn't exist. But intelligence professionals would understand that certain outcomes had required interventions that exceeded conventional military or diplomatic capabilities, that some crises had been resolved through methods that couldn't be officially acknowledged, that Rebecca Martinez's operational activities had prevented conflicts that would have cost thousands of lives. Her legacy would live not in historical recognition, but in the conflicts that never escalated, the diplomatic relationships that survived when they should have failed, and the lives that continued because someone had capabilities that officially didn't exist, but unofficially preserved the society that had given her those capabilities. The balance between effectiveness and accountability would continue, monitored by congressional oversight that ensured democratic values while protecting operational security. The compromise wasn't perfect, but it was workable. And in a world of imperfect threats, workable solutions were often the best that democratic society could achieve. In the end, the quiet professional had proved that American democracy could evolve to protect itself without abandoning the principles that defined it. The woman they'd ordered off the tarmac had become living proof that extraordinary circumstances could be accommodated through extraordinary arrangements that preserve both effectiveness and accountability. The jet doors had opened for her alone, but the precedent she'd established would serve American democracy for generations to come. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.